Hi everyone, and welcome to the Newsagent podcast. I'm Susie Lysett, Content Executive at Goodlord. In today's episode, we're going to delve into the topic of the evolving role of letting agents and their obvious importance to landlords. Obviously, that's quite a broad topic, but I'm joined today by Gerry, her director at Hirsch Estates, who will be sharing her expertise on what landlords are looking for. We'll touch a bit on legislation, the professionalisation of the industry, what bits you could try to do to keep your landlords interested in your agency, amongst other topics. So welcome to the podcast, Gerry.
Oh, thank you, Susie. Thank you so much for inviting me. I look forward to chatting to you.
I know, me with you as well. So I know that Hirsch Estates, obviously, from my understanding, you're an independent agency. You're based in Croydon, I believe. But perhaps just to kick us off, if you could tell us a bit about your agency.
Okay, so Hirsch Estates was formed just over a year ago, and we've been really quite lucky in that we've been fortunate enough to build a reasonable portfolio quite quickly. I think some of the reasons I'd put this down to would be an awful lot of planning before starting the business. Experience, obviously there's myself and my co-director Rafal, so he's previously worked for a corporate letting agency. He was in the business for around 10 years. We've both worked for an independent local agent as well, which is how we met 4.5 years ago. And I think, we've had incredible support from those that know us and that are already in the industry.
It's great that you obviously have that wealth of experience to bring to the table and that support. It sounds like a very good combination to me.
Thank you.
Well, then, obviously, hopefully this will be a very interesting conversation. So let's get stuck into the evolving role of letting agents. I'll start with a pretty open question, and then we can perhaps look at some of the aspects in more detail. But what do you think are the top things that landlords are looking for in their agents?
Well, I think it goes without saying, trust is a huge area, and transparency. But of course, if it's a new landlord and they don't know you, then that can only truly be established over the course of time. So I think if I were a landlord, I'd be looking for a high level of professionalism. I'd need to be sure that my investment was being managed in my best interests. I think one of the other things I'd be looking for is for an agent that's a member of a professional body, such as Property Mark. I just think knowing members are expected to comply with the code would definitely give me that extra bit of reassurance. I'd probably think I'd check things like how responsive an agent was, how they marketed a property. I think another good test would be obviously local knowledge.
Those certainly seem like some of the top things that landlords should be looking for or in an agent. Touching on some of those, then obviously this idea of professionalism within the field is obviously something which you hold quite close to your heart. Now, I know that obviously we're looking on the horizon. We've got the regulation of property agents and that side of things. What more could you say about the professionalisation and perhaps regulation of property agents? How important do you think that is for landlords?
Well, I think it's really important. As we all know, the industry isn't regulated, and I think that regulating the industry can only be positive for landlords as well as agents.
And perhaps then, as a relatively new agency, is that something that you're looking at focusing on yourselves and developing yourselves as you grow and communicating that to landlords? I mean, how do you go about sort of sharing the level of professionalism that you have at your agency with your landlords?
Well, I think it's really important. We make sure that we have regular contact with our landlords. I think communication is absolute key. So I think it's just a quick question of touching base with them, having regular conversations with them, particularly if there's any changes in legislation that we see coming up. And I think, we do also have overseas landlords that might not necessarily be in touch with what's happening in the UK because they're busy focusing on their own businesses. So they rely on us to be that information, feed them back that information.
Obviously, this idea of, legislation, it's always a big topic to touch on. how would you say that you yourselves as agents keep on top of the latest legislation? How do you make sure that you're always at the forefront so you can communicate that to your landlords?
Good question. Well, there's an awful lot of training courses available, which, we try to attend regularly. There's also a host of free, live and recorded webinars that are really informative. We often look to Good Lord, actually, who run some brilliant sessions, and Rightmove also provide those. They're another.
And obviously, the past year has seen a fair amount of legislation. I mean, there's always new legislation in the lettings field popping up. But are there any key pieces of legislation that you have been keeping your eye on, or that you're looking forward to in the future that you think will have a pretty big impact on landlords?
Good question. I'd say that legislation in the letting sector has probably been the most biggest challenge of all. It brings huge responsibilities with it, and it just demonstrates that managing a property doesn't just start and end with finding suitable tenants who consistently pay the rent. It's much bigger than that. I think with all the frequent changes in law, there are far-reaching consequences if landlords and agents don't comply. Yeah, so I just think it's really vital for us to keep on top of that and communicate that with our landlords to protect them and tenants.
It is a very good point. I mean, from both sides, it is landlords and tenants as well. Just making sure that you can you have that information for all of your different areas of clientele.
I can think of a good example, actually. I kind of skipped that, but and I know regulation isn't necessarily always popular with some, but I think health and safety standards would be a really good example. There was the introduction of electrical installations, where in properties they have to be inspected at least every 5 years by a qualified and competent person, which I think goes back to, making sure that obviously the tenants are safe, but the landlords as well, it's protecting them as well. I just don't think there was enough accountability previously. So I think that can only serve to improve things.
No, it's true. I think that is a key word, accountability, when you're looking at whether it's regulation, legislation, all of this that's coming in. It's to help protect tenants, but it is also there to protect landlords as well, and just make everybody work together in the best possible way, really. I know that there is also the argument, the side of things where because of the huge amount of legislation, some landlords are perhaps a bit less enthusiastic about being landlords. How do you advise your landlords who might be a bit intimidated by the amount of legislation and regulation that's in the market?
Oh yeah, I understand. I mean, I think there have been some landlords that have obviously clearly struggled with lots of changes, less tax breaks, there's been rent arrears, and I think, unfortunately for some of those landlords, it's forced them into a position where they've had to sell. But my advice would be just, if you can weather the storm, stick with it, because I think there's always going to be a demand for rental property.
I think that especially at the moment, I know that from our data, we're seeing that there is a lot of demand from tenants. It is quite high at the moment. So it's true that it's a bit of a long-term game, but does seem to be a good one to stick at.
I think in terms of legislation, I do think that landlords have had it particularly hard. And I can think of a piece of legislation that I feel quite negative about personally, which was the tenant fee ban. And I know that the aim was to improve transparency and provide a better deal for tenants, but I just think the decision was unbalanced, and it's left both landlords and agents to absorb the costs. I think that's been a tough one. Landlords already have additional financial burdens to the point where, as I've said, they're exiting the market. So I think it's been difficult for them. I think, in my view, it would have been more reasonable to cap a fee across the board, which would have meant a more even playing field.
No, I suppose that's a fair point that you're making. Do you find that the fact that this legislation, this regulation is growing, such as the tenant fees ban and so on, Do you think that it's made landlords look to agents more? Do you think that they're now, leaning on agents more and looking more for that support?
I think that's a good question too, because I think actually yes and no. Yes, I think for those landlords that don't necessarily have the time to be keeping up with legislation and they value the importance of it, they do look to us to support them in that area. I also think there are some landlords that, because of all the financial burdens, one of the things they think they don't need potentially is a letting agent, and that they can do it on their own. And actually, I think economically, in the long run, it might not be the best decision.
True, there are always those two sides to this story. There will always be people of those differing opinions, I suppose. We'll be right back after this message.
Are you always worrying about compliance at your agency and just want it off your plate? Well, that's one of the things Good Lord's here to help you with. From sending the How to Rent guide and attaching property certificates to taking the right deposit amounts and sending prescribed information, we'll help you take care of lettings compliance all in one place. Head to goodlord.co to check compliance off your to-do list. Good Lord, it's just that good.
And perhaps to come back to, you touched on before that you have quite a few overseas landlords.
Sure, yeah.
I just wondered really how, because presumably you have domestic landlords as well, one's based in the UK. So how does your approach differ for these two sort of customer bases?
Well, I think firstly, and most importantly at the moment, I think for our overseas landlords, they have got less physical control than our UK-based landlords, especially with all the travel restrictions that have been in place. So I think, again, they're relying heavily on us to ensure that, their investment is being looked after safely. I think that there's obviously also the tax implications to consider. So as we all know, if you're a landlord residing outside the UK for more than 6 months, you're considered an overseas landlord. So we're always very clear from the start on how the non-resident landlord scheme operates and what our statutory duties as an agent are. I think, obviously communication, ultimately, communication is key, particularly if you're working with those in different time zones.
That's a very good point. I mean, communication, like you say, it is always key with wherever you're based, but navigating different time zones and so on, and making sure that everything runs smoothly around that must be you must need to be very organised to do so.
We try. I just want to touch on, I think another key area is obviously tax in itself, which we can't advise on, but we do have expert tax advice available to support landlords if they need it.
That is true. I mean, it must be. Do you think that has Brexit, has this yet had an impact that you've seen? Whether it is around the tax side, whether it is around, any other aspect of working with landlords overseas, or has the pandemic sort of overshadowed any potential changes that may have?
I think the pandemic's overshadowed it for us, but I do think with Brexit, I can't really say there's a shortage of tenants because there isn't a shortage of tenants, but I think probably the pandemic's overshadowed that for us anyway. But in terms of the actual property management, there's no difference. We'd look after properties of overseas landlords in the same way that we would with our UK landlords.
If I may ask, I mean, talking about the fact then that the pandemic has overshadowed things a lot recently in any industry, I suppose, not just lettings. But was there anything that you did differently that you perhaps weren't anticipating doing in order to support your landlords? You've already touched on the fact that communication, that's obviously always key, and just making sure that you're in contact with your landlords and so on. But are there any other aspects that you didn't anticipate having to do in order to support your landlords?
Communication. I mean, I remember obviously March last year, the hours we put in because there were a lot of people, obviously lots of tenants panicking, worried about their jobs, which, obviously in turn is going to impact on landlords. So again, I just think it was that communication. I think some tenants were in a genuine position where they were struggling. So it was about communicating with landlords about perhaps reducing the rent for a period, offering them a payment plan, and again, just, you know, making it as comfortable as possible for landlords and tenants.
Yeah, as you say, it is something that had to be communicated to tenants as well as landlords. I mean, I know that you mentioned before that you do use rent protection to support landlords. I mean, is that something that you've seen increasing in, I use the word popularity,
Yes.
increasing in necessity, perhaps increasing in importance over the past, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I can think of probably, out of all our landlords, very few that have taken it up now with us.
It's good to know that product is there.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, we haven't had to use it, fortunately, as in implement the process. But I think it's just reassuring for landlords knowing it's there and their investment is protected, regardless of their position.
Yeah, no, that's true. It's that peace of mind, I suppose, that it would tend to give. But yeah, and obviously throughout all of this, you know, you're there, you're supporting agents, you're making sure you're up to date on legislation, and obviously you're demonstrating your professionalism to them. I mean, is there anything else that you do in order to keep your current landlords, you know, sort of interested in your agency, to attract new landlords to your agency? Are there any other sort of initiatives that you have within that area?
Yeah, I think there's. I mean, myself and Rafal we've all constantly got our heads together to think about, you know, how we can help landlords, particularly at a time like we're in at the moment. So, I mean, we often send out newsletters. That's one of the things we do. We are currently offering landlords a 2-month free management period. So nothing dynamic or new, but we just get the feeling that, you know, every little helps. We do write blogs. Yes, we write blogs. So we try and keep them up to date with all the changes that are happening.
I mean, I suppose it just all ties in with the fact that you do communicate so well with your landlords, with your tenants as well. It's just making sure that you have different sources of information for them to be able to dip into and keep them up to date.
Right, we've got one other product actually that is new for us, which we've recently launched, called the Renton Advance option, abbreviated to Arrow. So this is basically a model where landlords are paid a year's rent in advance, although the rent is still collected monthly from their tenants. So practically speaking, it's similar to our conventional fully managed service. But I just think from a landlord's perspective, they seem to be faced with ever increasing taxes and rules. So we just felt that, you know, Arrow was potentially a really useful product for them. Essentially, they can take cash quickly, apply it to their assets and increase capital, as opposed to waiting 1 or 2 years.
It's a really interesting concept. I mean, is that something for new landlords? Is that something, because I think I may have spotted that out on social media, your social media. So is that something to, you know, sort of a strategy, as it were, to attract new landlords and show how supportive you are in that area?
Yeah, I think partly, but also I just think for us, it gives landlords that flexibility and choice. We've already spoken to some of our existing landlords who like the idea, but you know, their position is such that they're happy just to continue receiving their rent monthly. But for us, at least, you know, the option's there. I
suppose at the moment, especially with, you know, the furlough scheme ending and things like that, we don't really know what the future will look like. So it's nice to have that bit of stability and security. So it's that's a really interesting concept. Well, I mean, looking to the future, I know that I just said it's very difficult to predict what's going to happen. So but I'll ask the question anyway. You know, obviously everything that we've discussed so far points to the fact that agents, they do continue to be important. You know, whether some landlords will see it as see increased importance in agents. Some may think that actually with the legislation, the prices are increasing perhaps for themselves. They'll perhaps take on more themselves. But what do you think about how this will evolve looking to the future? You know, do you think that agents will continue to increase in importance? Do you think that their role will change in some other way?
Well, I think, of course, agents are always going to play an important role. I think technology and service is probably the future for agents. Going back to many years ago, those systems that have previously been in place and worked for years are no longer working as effectively.
That's true. I do think everything does seem to be speeding up quite a bit in terms of the technology side. I know I'm perhaps a little bit biased working for a prop tech organisation, but it does seem to be heading that way, especially with remote working over the past year or so. It's definitely pushed people more towards looking for these slightly more virtual solutions. So it does seem to be a bit of an accelerating trend, perhaps we could say.
I just think that it's already a challenging market, and I just think that it's really important that we adapt with the times. And I think for agents that don't adapt to those changes might not survive.
It's challenging not just for landlords, but it can be challenging for agents as well. Let's not forget. So. Yeah. With that said, perhaps to round off our conversation, again, looking to the future, would you say that you're optimistic for the future of the industry at large, the lettings industry at large?
Do you know what? I am optimistic. I think predictions seem to vary quite significantly. Obviously, don't have a crystal ball, so it's difficult to say. But I think there is an ongoing demand for tenants. But I think also there are landlords that are having to sell because of increasing legislations, rent arrears, reduced tax and so on. So there is sadly that proportion of landlords that have had no choice. But I just think, as I mentioned earlier, if they can weather this storm, ride the wave, then they should hold on to their investments, because I think it looks positive for the future.
That's a good note to end on. I think it's been a pleasure speaking with you for our podcast.
You too. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.